Now, I'm not one to gossip, but I will bring you the tea. Welcome to Chronicle Speaks.
Please, I don't have any time for any gossip now. Eh? Yes.
Look at you.
Miss Dawn Richard, former member of the hit group Danity Kane, also Diddy's group Dirty Money, was found by way of her auditioning for Diddy's hit television show Making the Band. And of course, if you ever saw the show Making the Band, we've all heard the name calling. We've seen how he's embarrassed these women on national TV, but no one was really privy to what was going on behind the scenes. Dawn has now joined the ranks of women and men to sue the disgraced rapper who was once deemed a mogul. Dawn Richard filed suit in the Southern District of New York yesterday under the Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Law, and in this lawsuit she states that she witnessed Combs brutally attack Cassie Ventura, his longtime girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, on several occasions, and these would be times that Diddy would allegedly threaten Dawn after these attacks and tell Dawn that if she said anything there would be consequences, and that he knew how to make people go missing. Richard also claims that she was groped by Diddy and locked inside of a car for hours. We are going to unpack this story, but before we do, please be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss out on any news regarding this story and so much more. Now let's get back into it. Cassie Ventura coming forward with her lawsuit late last year, and then the video being released of Diddy attacking Cassie has caused many of his other alleged victims to come forward, now feeling a safe place to vent their own trauma caused by Diddy. And I now have a feeling that when it comes to these lawsuits, we are going to learn the true definition of can't stop, won't stop. Dawn Richard, who I've always seen as a talented singer, writer, and innovative artist, has seen firsthand for the past 20 years Diddy's abuse to herself and to others. So without further ado, we will read these court docs over here to get down to the nitty-gritty. As I always say, I read so you don't have to. So get your coffee, get your tea ready, and sit back. Your girl Chronicle got you covered. In or around 2004, Miss Richard was selected to participate in season 3 of MTV's network reality television show Making the Band. The show centered around the formation and development of a new musical group under the mentorship of Mr. Combs. The contestants would compete and be chosen by Mr. Combs to form a band, which would go on to create albums and perform. For aspiring artists like Miss Richard, Making the Band represented a concrete path to a career in the entertainment industry. Miss Richard appeared in season 3 and 4 of Making the Band, which aired in 2005, and in season 5 of Making the Band, which aired in 2009. Out of thousands of contestants, Miss Richard, along with approximately 12 other women, were selected to participate in season 3 of Making the Band. 5 women, including Miss Richard, were ultimately chosen to be in the group Danity Kane, which was named by Miss Richard. Prior to and including the first Danity Kane album, Making the Band was filmed entirely at Daddy's house recording studio at 3120 West 44th Street in New York, New York. The Making the Band content that focused on Danity Kane's work on its second album, Welcome to the Dollhouse, was filmed at Daddy's house and at Mr. Combs' Miami residence. Other Making the Band episodes included Los Angeles as a third filming location. Upon information and belief to create Making the Band, camera crews filmed 24 hours a day, gathering months worth of footage to condense into mere hours of entertainment for viewers. Danity Kane released its self-titled album in August 2006 and its second album, Welcome to the Dollhouse, in March 2008. Danity Kane's first album sold 4 million copies, and the damages to Miss Richard for unpaid salaries are estimated to $1 million. Danity Kane's second album, Welcome to the Dollhouse, sold over 2 million copies, and damages to Miss Richard for unpaid salaries and royalties are estimated at $500,000. Damages on unpaid wages for touring on over 100 dates for Miss Richard with Danity Kane are estimated at $1.8 million. Mr. Combs fired bandmate Aubrey O'Day and Juanita D. Woods Woodgett from Danity Kane on live television at the height of its fame in 2008, which resulted in Danity Kane being disbanded in 2009. Part 2. Miss Richard first encounters Mr. Combs' aggressive, intimidating behavior and animus towards women. During the auditions and on the set of Making the Band, Mr. Combs projected an aura of superiority, wealth, and power. Mr. Combs regularly wore sunglasses and avoided looking the female contestants in the eyes, contributing to an atmosphere of uncertainty and intimidation. During auditions, Mr. Combs spoke to the female contestants in a hostile, condescending manner, making disparaging gender-based remarks such as calling them fat, ugly, bitches, and hoes. Miss Richard felt threatened and intimidated by Mr. Combs' blatant disdain for the young women like herself who were excited for the opportunity to be on his show. Once the ban was made, Mr. Combs' contempt for women was rapidly apparent as he continued to display aggressive and hostile behavior towards Miss Richard and her all-female Danity Kane bandmates. Mr. Combs regularly referred to the 5 women as bitches and hoes and denigrated their physical appearances. By way of example, Mr. Combs stated Miss Richard was too skinny and needed to do something about this, talking about her face. On one occasion, in or around 2005, during the first season of Making the Band 3, Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs' ex-partner and the mother of 3 of his children, Kim Porter, leaving Mr. Combs' recording studio in tears with visible facial injuries, including a lacerated lip. Realizing that Mr. Combs was capable of committing acts of violence against women caused Miss Richard to feel deep apprehension and fear that Mr. Combs could one day physically harm her. Miss Richard was present when Mr. Combs was introduced to Cassandra Cassie Ventura for the first time in or around 2006. The moment Mr. Combs first saw Miss Ventura, his demeanor noticeably shifted. Mr. Combs positioned himself directly in front of Miss Ventura's seat, invading her personal space, and fixated on her with an intense, unyielding stare, isolating her from the other people in the room, including Miss Ventura's then-boyfriend, music producer, Ryan Leslie. Coincidentally, the first meeting between Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura was the first time Miss Richard was in Mr. Combs' presence without a camera crew filming. Observing Mr. Combs behave in such an intimidating, predatory manner the first time they were off camera made Miss Richard feel deeply apprehensive and afraid of him. Subsequently, Miss Ventura ended her relationship with Mr. Leslie and began dating Mr. Combs, who became violent and abusive towards her. Part 3. Danity Kane's sexual harassment, inhumane treatment, and denial of basic needs by Mr. Combs. For the majority of Miss Richard's tenure as a member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Mr. Combs required her to remain at his various residences and studios in New York, Los Angeles, Florida, and New Jersey for activities such as recording, rehearsing, dressing, preparing costumes, and exercising. Throughout the productions of Making the Band 3 and 4, Mr. Combs deprived Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates of basic needs such as adequate food and sleep. When Miss Richard or her Danity Kane bandmates requested meals or rest, Mr. Combs refused and chastised them with derogatory comments like, "You bitches don't want this," or "Y'all are not hungry enough, and I'm paying you bitches to work." This demeaning behavior gradually undermined Miss Richard's confidence and contributed significantly to her growing feelings of insecurity and fear of reprisal from Mr. Combs. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs would regularly be awake for prolonged periods of time because he was high on drugs. During these periods, Mr. Combs demanded continuous access to Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates, often forcing them to record and rehearse for stretches of 36 to 48 hours without breaks. Forced to choose between eating and sleeping, Miss Richard lost a significant amount of weight, weighing approximately 100 pounds at the height of 5'4". Miss Richard began to normalize these extreme conditions and perceived them as standard requirements of her participation in Danity Kane. Mr. Combs regularly sent his associates to wake Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates in the overnight hours so he could watch them rehearse. The regularity of these disturbances led Miss Richard to adapt by sleeping in a sitting position, fully dressed and with makeup on, heightening her anxiety. Over time, this abnormal sleeping arrangement came to feel routine, further normalizing Mr. Combs' invasive demands. In addition to exhausting rehearsals, Mr. Combs required Miss Richard and her bandmates to participate in intense workouts with a personal trainer. On one occasion, while running on the beach, Miss Richard became so dehydrated that she vomited. Instead of offering medical assistance, MTV's network's camera crew filmed the incident, contributing to her acceptance of such treatment as part of her professional life. The unrelenting and rigorous schedule of rehearsals, performance, and near constant filming that Mr. Combs imposed caused Miss Richard to experience extreme weight loss, dehydration, fatigue, and painful rashes from the microphone pack she was required to wear on her back. These conditions intensified Miss Richard's feelings of powerlessness as she increasingly viewed them as part of her professional reality and feared the consequences of any resistance. In a further assertion of power and dominance, Mr. Combs insisted on holding meetings while dressed only in his underwear. On one occasion in 2008 at his Miami residence, Mr. Combs emailed Miss Richard directing her to meet him in the living room. When she arrived, he was wearing only his underwear. Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs to put on his clothes, but he refused, stating, "This is my fucking house. Mr. Combs then conducted a meeting lasting approximately an hour while dressed in his underwear, causing Ms. Richard to feel violated and embarrassed and amplifying her feelings of powerlessness. Following the official Danity Kane breakup in early 2009, effectuated by Mr. Combs, Ms. Richard experienced significant financial hardship. With no prospective opportunities for employment within the entertainment field, Ms. Richard spent several months traveling from Baltimore to Daddy's House recording studios in New York without pay or allocated budget. Mr. Combs promised that Ms. Richard's compositions would result in payment of license fees and royalties pursuant to her contract with Bad Boy Records. However, no such compensation was ever reported or paid to Ms. Richard. Damages related to these continuing copyright infringements will be provided at trial. Part 4. Diddy Dirty Money. Ms. Richard experiences Mr. Combs' gender-based physical violence, criminal acts, sexual assault, threats, and intimidation. By the fall of 2009, many of Ms. Richard's compositions had been recorded by other Bad Boy record artists. Due to the success of her compositions, Ms. Richard was invited to meet with musical artist Kalina Harper, also known as Miss Harper, and shortly thereafter, Mr. Combs, Ms. Richard, and Miss Harper formed a new group, Diddy Dirty Money. Initial recording for Diddy Dirty Money's album Last Train to Paris took place in Mr. Combs' home on Doheny Drive in Los Angeles, California. On the first day of recording, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper arrived at Mr. Combs' home and waited in the kitchen, where Mr. Combs' girlfriend, Ms. Ventura, was frying eggs for him. Ms. Richard observed Mr. Combs come down the stairs looking high on drugs, enter the kitchen, and approach Ms. Ventura and scream, "I've been asking you for my shit. I can't stand you, bitch. You never do it right." Mr. Combs pushed Ms. Ventura against the wall and choked her, then picked up the scalding hot pan of eggs and threw it at her, causing her to fall to the ground in a fetal position. Cursing and screaming, Mr. Combs dragged Ms. Ventura up the stairs. Frozen in shock and terror, Ms. Richard heard glass shattering, crashing, and banging noises as Mr. Combs dragged Ms. Ventura up the stairs. Ms. Richard wanted to intervene and help Ms. Ventura, but Ms. Harper adamantly refused to interfere in Mr. Combs' relationship and physically led Ms. Richard out of the residence. Terrified and shaken, Ms. Richard returned to her hotel, where she was unable to sleep due to worrying about Ms. Ventura and her own safety. The following day, Ms. Richard received a call demanding that she return to Mr. Combs' residence to continue recording. Mr. Combs brought Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper into the recording room at the studio, locked the door, dimmed the lights, and gave each of them flowers. Mr. Combs went on at length stating, "This is normal. This is just a lover's argument where no one was hurt. This is what love is. I'm giving you an opportunity. If you want to make it, you'll shut your mouth. If you say anything, there will be consequences." Mr. Combs further warned that people end up missing, being threatened while locked for over 20 minutes in a small enclosed space with Mr. Combs after observing Mr. Combs violently assault Ms. Ventura the day before. Ms. Richard was terrified and genuinely believed that Mr. Combs would follow through on his threats. In or around November 2009, after the Soul Train Awards in Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Combs flew Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper to his house in New York on his private jet for an after party. There were many well-known celebrities at the after party, and copious amounts of illegal drugs were being openly consumed. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs had arranged for dozens of young women and girls, some of whom appeared to be underage, to be transported to the party. The women arrived wearing little to no clothing and were given drugs and alcohol. Many of them appeared lethargic and passed out while Mr. Combs and his guests performed sexual acts on them. Ms. Richard believed that her presence at the party was a test to see whether Mr. Combs could trust her. Mr. Combs repeatedly said things like, "This is a buffet. Enjoy yourself. This is what we do. This is how we party." Ms. Richard felt shocked and horrified at the sight of Mr. Combs and his guests violating incapacitated young women, and implored Mr. Combs' personal assistant, Capricorn Clark, to allow her to leave. Ms. Clark insisted that Ms. Richard wait 15 minutes for Ms. Clark to make it make sense. That is, to make Ms. Richard's exit less conspicuous so that Mr. Combs would not notice that she had left. Knowing that she was not free to leave and had to wait for Ms. Clark to help her orchestrate her departure, Ms. Richard experienced feelings of panic and being trapped against her will. Mr. Combs regularly placed Ms. Richard in similar situations with no means to escape. At Mr. Combs' drug-fueled parties, his guests, including Ms. Richard, were required to surrender their phones upon entry. Mr. Combs kept the doors locked and guarded by security personnel, making it impossible for Ms. Richard to leave without alarming Mr. Combs that she had done so. Mr. Combs hired police officers to attend his parties, sending a clear message to guests that his influence extended to law enforcement officers and creating a climate of fear and a tactic, warning that reporting him to authorities would be both unacceptable and futile. On many occasions, Mr. Combs had parties at his Miami, Florida residence that lasted for several days. At one of the parties, Ms. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs openly stating that he had arranged for busloads of young, exotic girls such as mixed black and Asian, Indonesian, and albino. Once again, Ms. Richard observed inebriated young girls being sexually violated by Mr. Combs and his guests. In a state of panic and terror, Ms. Richard fled to the bedroom Mr. Combs had insisted she stay in and barricaded the door shut with furniture. Mr. Combs openly assaulted Ms. Ventura in front of Ms. Richard and other witnesses on multiple occasions. On one occasion, in or around the fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money was in New York preparing to perform at a festival. Inside their vehicle, Mr. Combs grabbed Ms. Ventura's neck, pulled her out of the van onto the grass, and pinned her head down, choking her while yelling, "You gonna get fucked up today." That incident took place in the backstage area just outside the festival and was entirely visible to passersby. In another instance, in or around early 2010, Mr. Combs punched Ms. Ventura in the face in the bathroom of a Los Angeles party. Frequently, when Ms. Ventura attempted to voice an opinion or stand up to Mr. Combs, he would strike her and wrap his hands around her throat and choke her. On the first several occasions that they observed Mr. Combs assault Ms. Ventura, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper spoke with Ms. Ventura to support and encourage Ms. Ventura in escaping her abusive relationship with Mr. Combs. Every time that Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper tried to intervene, Mr. Combs learned of the conversation and became irate. Mr. Combs screamed at the women, "Y'all bitches don't get in my relationship. Don't tell my bitch Ms. Ventura what she needs to be doing. Just make the money and shut the fuck up. I end artists. I shelve careers. You could be missing. And you bitches want to die today?" Among other threats. Part 5. Interscope Records enabled Mr. Combs' gender-motivated violence. In or around late 2009 or early 2010, Bad Boy Entertainment, also known as Bad Boy, entered an agreement with Interscope Geffen A&M Records, which is also known as Interscope, upon information and belief. Bad Boy was paid $50 million in exchange for Bad Boy's future releases being distributed through Interscope. In so doing, Mr. Combs intended to capitalize on Interscope's significant resources and enhance the promotion and sales of Bad Boy's releases, including Diddy Dirty Money's upcoming album. In the weeks and months leading up to the Bad Boy Interscope deal, Mr. Combs had frequent meetings with producer and then CEO of Interscope Records, Jimmy Iovine. On one such occasion, Combs hosted a dinner at a West Hollywood, California restaurant, which Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper were required to attend. Among the guests at the dinner were celebrities like Neyo and Usher, as well as Mr. Iovine. At the dinner, Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura had an argument in front of the dinner guests. Mr. Combs hissed at Ms. Ventura in a screaming whisper and forcibly punched her in the stomach, causing her to double over in visible pain, crying. Ms. Clark escorted Ms. Ventura out of the restaurant, and Mr. Combs remained and continued socializing with the dinner guests. At this point, Interscope Records clearly had actual knowledge that Mr. Combs was dangerous around females and that Combs was willingly to brazenly batter a female in public. Even after Mr. Iovine watched Mr. Combs commit a violent assault in front of numerous high-profile witnesses, the Bad Boy Interscope deal took place and remained in effect, providing Mr. Combs with immense financial reward and enabling him to commit further acts of violence without fear of repercussions. Watching Mr. Combs openly assault Ms. Ventura in front of Mr. Levine and various celebrities, and observing that other powerful music industry representatives were complicit in Mr. Combs' behavior, amplified Ms. Richard's fears that Mr. Combs could one day harm her and that his actions would be accepted and normalized by everyone surrounding him. As part of the agreement between Bad Boy and Interscope, Interscope heavily promoted Diddy Dirty Money's Last Train to Paris album. Mr. Iovine had presented Mr. Combs with a demo of Coming Home for him to produce a song that would become a multi-platinum hit. Mr. Iovine was encouraging Mr. Combs to develop a new sound for the album, into which Interscope was investing significant resources. Ms. Richard, Ms. Harper, and Ms. Ventura all provided vocal performances for the project. Released in November 2010, the album Last Train to Paris became Diddy Dirty Money's most commercially successful project, providing vast financial reward to both Interscope and Mr. Combs. Part 6, Diddy Dirty Money. Mr. Combs subjects Ms. Richard to labor trafficking and oppressive working conditions. In or around the fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money began recording the song Love Come Down. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs continued to use drugs that caused him to remain awake for prolonged periods of time. When he was awake, he would demand that Miss Richard and Miss Harper record in the studio, where they would spend 3 to 4 consecutive days recording without a break to eat or sleep. Mr. Combs required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to remain at his homes continuously, denying the opportunity to return to their hotel rooms for breaks. The degree of control Mr. Combs exercised over Miss Richard's daily life and basic needs exasperated the significant power imbalance and threatening atmosphere that ensured Miss Richard's compliance with his demand. Mr. Combs regularly left the studio and required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to stay and write verses to songs. Occasionally, Miss Richard tried to leave to get something to eat or to go to her hotel. Whenever Miss Richard tried to leave, Mr. Combs would call and demand, "Where the fuck are you? And we have an album to make." Mr. Combs frequently made threats, especially if they asked for food or rest, stating, "You're a bitch. I don't want to see your fucking face. I make niggas go missing, and I make things go away." Each time, Miss Richard returned to the studio immediately, believing that Mr. Combs was capable of following through with his threats. Mr. Combs criticized Miss Richard for being too skinny, yet denied her request for food and demanded that she drink only peanut butter shakes. Mr. Combs had full meals prepared by a chef and ate them in front of Miss Richard and Miss Harper, never offering them food. Miss Richard and Miss Harper begged for food and rest breaks, but Mr. Combs refused, making statements such as, "Absolutely fucking not, and that is not what it takes to be great." Mr. Combs' responses underscored the threats he posed and heightened Miss Richard's concerns for her safety and well-being. As Miss Richard continued to work non-stop, transitioning between the studio, rehearsals, workouts, and back to the studio, she became severely dehydrated and experienced chronic stomach cramping from being undernourished and extremely thin. On the numerous occasions that she told Mr. Combs that she was not feeling well, he called her lazy and dismissed her health concerns, instilling in the further apprehension of communicating her need. In or around the summer of 2010, Miss Richard experienced abdominal pain, swollen glands, and a fever. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with arthralgia, which happens when you have joint pain due to overuse, sprains, tendonitis, and infection, anemia, and a low white blood cell count. Miss Richard presented Mr. Combs with her medical records specifying that she needed to emphasize eating well, being adequately hydrated, and getting adequate rest. But Mr. Combs ordered her to report to the studio the next day for another multi-day recording session. Mr. Combs' blatant disregard for her health and well-being cemented Miss Richard's fear of his authority and control over her career and health. Miss Richard continued to witness Mr. Combs' abuse towards Miss Ventura. Miss Ventura often wore sunglasses and makeup in an attempt to hide visible injuries. These incidents further solidified Miss Richard's fear of Mr. Combs, as they were constant reminders of the physical dangers she potentially could and eventually would face. Mr. Combs often exhibited uncontrollable anger during recording sessions, throwing objects like albums, laptops, and food against the wall or at individuals. Mr. Combs frequently flew into frenzied, unpredictable rages. Miss Richard feared making any missteps that could direct his anger towards her. However, her fears went beyond her immediate physical safety because she had witnessed Mr. Combs' violent nature, a side of Mr. Combs that the world had not yet seen. She feared that falling out of Mr. Combs' good graces, or worse, standing up to him or speaking out against him, could result in serious harm to her. Miss Richard frequently thought about Mr. Combs' threat about making people go missing and feared taking any action that could label her as a target. Despite Mr. Combs' violent threats and misogyny, Diddy Dirty Money experienced significant sales of records, selling 2 million copies of one single, 500,000 copies of another in the US, and in Australia, 5 million single copies. Miss Richard's unpaid wages and royalties are estimated at $1.2 million. Miss Richard's unpaid touring wages are estimated at $350,000 for touring dates within the United States alone. Part 7, Ciroc, Diddy Beats, non-payment. In or around the summer of 2009, Miss Richard and Miss Harper were required by Mr. Combs to perform as part of Diddy Dirty Money and attend numerous promotional promotional events, including late or overnight parties, all of which were under contract between Mr. Combs and Ciroc Vodka or between Mr. Combs and Diddy Beats pursuant to the Bad Boy Interscope record deal. Ms. Richard was never compensated for the extra time she spent fulfilling Mr. Combs' promotional contracts, including the Ciroc and the Diddy Beats campaign. Mr. Combs was paid approximately $250,000 per Ciroc appearance. Mr. Combs did not compensate Ms. Richard or Ms. Harper for these appearances, other than just $5,000 each on a handful of occasions. Mr. Combs' ongoing explanation for withholding compensation was that their appearances were a requirement for their tour. Additionally, Ms. Richard was required to appear and to promote Diddy's beats through parties, album songs, and videos. Over time, Mr. Combs was paid $6.25 million for 25 Ciroc shows that Ms. Richard was required to attend. Following each show, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper approached Mr. Combs to inquire about their insufficient and sporadic payments. Mr. Combs routinely responded with statements such as, "You bitches aren't grateful and you don't want this." Ms. Richard estimates losses for Ciroc campaign promotions totaling at least $1,562,500. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs received an advance on Diddy Beats for which Ms. Richard received no compensation. Part 8, Mr. Combs sexually harassing and assaulting Ms. Richard. Between approximately 2009 and 2011, throughout Diddy Dirty Money's recording process, rehearsals, and performances, Mr. Combs repeatedly ordered Ms. Richard to strip down to her underwear. He frequently referred to her as a bitch or whore and made demeaning remarks about her body, alternating calling her lazy, fat, ugly, and skinny, particularly in front of his friends, producers, and bodyguards. Mr. Combs frequently held meetings with Ms. Richard wearing only his underwear, despite Ms. Richard's protests and repeated requests for him to put on clothing. In response, Mr. Combs called her a bitch and whore and reminded her that she should be grateful for the opportunity to be there. Often while they were recording in the studio, Mr. Combs would hold parties where he would invite young men and women who were often scantily dressed and appeared underage to use drugs and engage in sex acts. Ms. Richard observed Mr. Combs and his colleagues kissing, groping, and inappropriately touching the young women. Upon information and belief, the participants often left the immediate area to have sex and returned shortly thereafter. On numerous occasions between approximately 2009 and 2011, under the guise of preparing for performances, Mr. Combs would intrude into Ms. Richard's changing room at Daddy's house unannounced while Ms. Richard was undressed. Even though a female stylist was present and assisting Ms. Richard with her wardrobe, Mr. Combs would grope Ms. Richard's body, including her bare buttocks and her chest area near her breast, with no legitimate purpose and without Ms. Richard's consent. Mr. Combs caressed her buttocks to show the stylist where he wanted her high-waisted panties positioned and attempted to touch her breasts, claiming to show the stylist where he wanted her bra straps to go. When Mr. Combs would enter the changing room, Ms. Richard would cover her chest with her hands to prevent Mr. Combs from seeing or touching her breasts. When Mr. Combs would touch her body, Ms. Richard would attempt to swat his hands away and state, "Don't touch me." Mr. Combs frequently smacked Ms. Richard's bare buttocks and often commented on her body, noticing that although she was too skinny, she had an ass. Ignoring her visible and communicated discomfort, Mr. Combs persisted and continued to intrude when Ms. Richard was in the dressing room, continued to touch her buttocks and breast area under the guise of showing the stylist what to do, and continued to smack her buttocks without her consent. In or around October 2010, Diddy Dirty Money performed in Glasgow, Scotland, where Mr. Combs engaged in overt sexual advances toward Ms. Richard. On numerous occasions when Ms. Richard exited the dressing room fully styled, Mr. Combs looked at her approvingly and smacked her buttocks while making comments such as, "You're looking good. Okay, Don, okay." And I see what it is in a flirtatious tone. Each time Ms. Richard moved away and asked him not to touch her, but Mr. Combs disregarded her protest. On their last night in Glasgow, Ms. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs and several other males gangbanging Mr. Combs' female assistant at the hotel pool. Ms. Richard immediately left and went to her hotel room. On their flight back to the United States the next day, Ms. Richard asked Mr. Combs where his assistant was. Mr. Combs replied, "I don't give a fuck where that bitch is." Ms. Richard later learned that Mr. Combs had taken the assistant's passport with him to the United States, leaving the assistant stranded in the United Kingdom. In Glasgow, Ms. Harper confided in Ms. Richard that her husband and manager, Tony Vick, also known as Mr. Vick, was abusive. After an especially severe assault, she confided in Ms. Richard that she wanted to leave Mr. Vick, and Ms. Richard helped her to plan an exit from the relationship. However, Ms. Harper and Mr. Vick reconciled, and both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick, who had a close relationship, learned of Ms. Richard's role in helping Ms. Harper. Both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick became noticeably distrustful of Ms. Richard, which exasperated her fears of harm and reprisal. When Mr. Combs would require the Diddy Dirty Money bandmates to stay at his residence in Miami, Ms. Richard would barricade herself inside her room at night, placing heavy furniture against the door because she feared being harmed in her sleep. In or around December 2010, Ms. Richard, Ms. Harper, and Ms. Ventura were in Mr. Combs' Los Angeles home when Mr. Combs stated, "I want to gift you fake titties for Christmas." Mr. Combs reached out and cupped Ms. Richard's breast without her permission and stated, "You're an A, I'm thinking a D." Ms. Richard recoiled in shock and left the room. Throughout the above-mentioned time period when Ms. Richard resisted Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs retaliated by denying her singing parts in songs, removing her from songs, refusing to allow her to sing in performances, and turning her mic off during performances. The more Ms. Richard rebuffed his advances, the more Mr. Combs' retaliatory behavior increased. Part 9. Mr. Combs assaults and falsely imprisons Ms. Richard. In or around December 2010, Diddy Dirty Money was preparing for an upcoming performance on Saturday Night Live SNL. As usual, rehearsals lasted for days without the opportunity to eat or rest, and the rehearsal schedule was unpredictable. After waiting all day for Mr. Combs to call and send a car, Ms. Richard received a phone call from Mr. Combs demanding, "Where the fuck are you bitches? You bitches don't want this. Y'all don't deserve to have someone pick you up. Get a cab." Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper immediately took a taxi to SIR Studios, 520 West 25th Street in New York, New York, anxious because Mr. Combs sounded enraged. Upon their arrival at SIR Studios, Mr. Combs and Harve Pierre were waiting for them in the lobby. Mr. Combs screamed obscenities at them. "Where the fuck were you bitches? You bitches don't want to win. You don't want this. I'm so tired of y'all." Ms. Richard noticed that people in the lobby were reacting to Mr. Combs' tirade. Embarrassed, Ms. Richard asked Mr. Combs to stop swearing and calling them bitches in front of everyone. Mr. Combs' facial expression shifted as he stepped towards Ms. Richard, raised his arm, and swung his fist towards her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit her, Ms. Richard braced for the impact. Before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs' bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio, and forced her into the Bad Boy Records Bentley that was parked outside. Mrs. Harper ran after Ms. Richard, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley doors with both women inside. Inside the vehicle, Ms. Richard realized that there was no interior door handles and that they were locked inside with no way to escape. Ms. Richard's belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Mrs. Harper's cell phone. Ms. Richard relayed to her father what had happened and that she needed help and feared that she would go missing. Later, Mr. Combs' bodyguard removed only Ms. Harper from the Bentley, leaving Ms. Richard locked in the car alone for over 2 hours. Ms. Richard screamed as loudly as she could, but no one responded. It was late in the evening in the wintertime, and the windows were heavily tinted, and the interior of the car was dark except for faint interior lights. Ms. Richard's belongings and winter coat were in the studio while the ignition was off and there was no heat. With Mr. Combs' prior threats and violence running through her mind, Ms. Richard felt sheer panic, terror, and feeling of claustrophobia at being locked in a small, dark, enclosed space with no way to communicate or call for help. She began to feel cold and feared for her life, not knowing when or if she would be released. Ms. Richard's father drove to New York from Baltimore and arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Ms. Richard from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Ms. Richard's father between several rooms at SIR Studio, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Ms. Richard's father expressed that he intended to contact police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs' threats and actions, which in turn made Ms. Richard feel terrified for herself and her family's safety. The next night, Diddy Dirty Money performed on SNL. Mr. Combs subsequently called Ms. Richard, complimented her performance, and concluded with a threat: "You don't call your dad unless you're in the hospital." Ms. Richard is suing Diddy for damages as a result of the acts and conducts complained of herein. Ms. Richard has suffered and will continue to suffer the loss of income, wages, benefits, royalties, promotional fees, touring fees, and other compensations. Ms. Richard has also suffered, among other things, future pecuniary losses, emotional pain, suffering, inconvenience, loss of enjoyment of life, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, insomnia, panic attacks, and other non-pecuniary losses, entitling her an award of compensatory and punitive damages, injunctive and declaratory relief, attorney fees and costs, and other remedies as this court may deem appropriate. I don't know about y'all, but this was a lot, and I actually believe Dawn. And if she did go through all of the things that she said she did, or even a portion of it, Diddy needs to pay that lady. What I need to do is hear from you. What do you think about all of this stuff Dawn has just put out there about your boy Diddy? Leave a comment and you know how we do. We'll talk about it down below. Talk to you guys later. Bye. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any of my new episodes.